Hi, I'm Malcolm Clemens Young, the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California, and thanks for joining us for the Forum Online. We may not be a nation of immigrants, as recent Forum guest and historian Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz argues in her latest book, but immigration continues to impact us all. Natural disasters, war, corruption, and oppression continue to drive migrants as they seek an opportunity to live in dignity and with a hope for the future. Under the Biden administration, there have been policy changes that have been welcomed by immigrant advocates. At the same time, migrants seeking asylum have overwhelmed the federal system for processing them, including thousands of unaccompanied minors. What is life like on the border today? What can and should be done about this humanitarian crisis? My guest tonight is the Reverend Canon David Chavez, who has spent nearly all his life breathing in the culture, customs, and geography of the United States southern border, from his childhood in the 1980s, growing up between border communities in Arizona and California, to his current role as the Diocese of Arizona's Canon for Border Ministries. Each year, the cathedral chooses a theme for inspiration and reflection, and in 2021, our theme is healing. We'll be talking tonight about what might heal the divides our borders cause as we seek to discover what unites us. David, thank you so much for joining us. We're so grateful that you took time out of your busy schedule to be with us.
Thank you so much. It's a joy and an honor to be here with you and with the entire Grace community and beyond. And so I'm very thankful and honored to be here this evening.
I wonder if you can just give us a little bit of a summary of just how things are at the border right now. Just what are you facing and what are you noticing these days?
Sure. The border, at least here in the state of Arizona and the state of Sonora, which is the border that we come up, are connected to. Things are beginning to sort of die down. There was a lot of activity maybe 3 or 4 months ago, but with the current policies at play, things have tapered off. We were seeing a lot of folks pursuing asylum, making their way across, taking the next step in the asylum process, but that has stopped. And so, again, it's a lively place. It's one of those spaces where you do see a constellation of pieces that come together, interests, desires, perspectives on, what it means to be an American, what it means to be a Mexican national. It's one of those spaces that's just dense with just activity, again, desire. So even though things have tapered quite a bit, there's nevertheless this life that continues to grow and move and shift along the Arizona-Mexico border. So that's what I'm seeing. I was there maybe, I think it was 2 weeks ago, visiting our shelter. And again, getting the sense that folks are having to reset once more to the Remain in Mexico policy. And so it's folks taking a step and learning just the back and forth that is our immigration policy. Luckily, the folks at the shelter that we support are in a space that is safe, that also provides them the necessary help to take the next step in the asylum process when that comes about. But yes, I would say things have tapered down, but yet nevertheless, there's tons of activity at play.
Yeah, I wonder if you can just describe your just experiences of just typical people who are coming across the border in Arizona these days. What places are they coming from, and what are their motivations, and what are their personal stories?
Certainly, yeah. At the shelter that we support, La Casa de Misericordia y de Todas Naciones in Nogales, Sonora, folks from across the world, folks from the Ukraine, folks from Russia, folks from Central America, different the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, folks that are coming through different parts of Mexico, Durango, Guanajuato, Sinaloa, and most folks are coming because they have taken a step and a stand against the in many instances the the untenable situations that they're living with or in the midst of. Most folks are coming looking for a safer space, future for not only themselves but their families. And you know, I talk about this in light of folks resisting, in many ways, spaces of death, spaces of oppression, spaces of domination, and moving towards life and hope. And so some of the stories that I've heard of folks who have lived in for generations in particular parts of Mexico or Central America. And because of criminal gangs and corruption at a variety of levels within the apparatuses put in place to keep people safe and to provide them means by which to, you know, call on authorities to help them when they're in need. When all of this breaks down, people step away and move on. And that's what we're seeing. A lot of folks moving and making that treacherous journey, hoping for a better life, and discovering that level of corruption is in many ways at various spaces along the journey, and they face treacherous situations and spaces. And so that's what I'm hearing. Those are some of the stories that are coming my way, that stories that are shared at our shelter, La Casa de Misericordia. It breaks your heart, but it also strengthens you when you see the resolve in the eyes and in the hearts of individuals who are saying yes to life.
Yeah. Yeah, it must take a tremendous amount of courage to kind of leave the place that you understand and to embark on this journey. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like children's experience of this. I mean, you have boys yourself, and I wonder what is it like for a child to arrive at the border, at the American border, and what is their experience like, you know, in terms of their interactions with the government and interaction with other travelers?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I've seen, and again, this is at La Casa de Misericordia, and we have wonderful therapists that meet with children so they can process their stories. There's a lot of trauma, a lot of trauma. And one of my friends, Valerie, shows up to do therapy through art and through bordados, and as a way to help children tell their story. And it allows therapists that are there working with children to get a sense of what they are carrying. I think many of them, I'd have to say, many of them coming with a deep sense of trauma. I think they also, I mean, they're leaving everything they've known, and their imaginary of life is just shifted. And they've made a treacherous journey, whether it's through organizations that bring and traffic folks, or through the famous La Bestia, the beast that train. These are children who at times, and when they arrive at the shelter, just have a glazed look on their eyes. And little by little, the community works at helping restore that sense of presence and joy. But I'd have to say that it breaks my heart, and it's just heartbreaking. And I think when they come to the border, I think they come with a glimmer of hope in their hearts, a glimmer they share with their parents, with their extended family that has traveled with them. And so there's this sense in which there's a resilience there. Yet there are moments when it's clouded by the trauma and the stories and the art that they sit down to depict, even renditions of individuals chasing one another with guns in their hands. This is a 9-year-old drawing his home village of a beautiful lake, beautiful mountains, a small home, and in the middle of that, this scene that breaks your heart and gives you an idea of some of the reality that is part of their daily their day in and day out life in different parts of the world.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just the change in the presidential administration and just how, whether that affects things on the ground and how it affects it. Like how are the policies of the Trump administration, the Biden, different and the same? And then what are you seeing in terms of changes ever since the election in 2020?
I think one of the more significant changes is though there are holdover policies, MPP, Title 42, that are part of the Trump administration, what has been surprising has been to see the level of infrastructure that is being built around the processes in place for making sure folks make it through the asylum process. So caseworkers that are assigned to individuals or families that track their progress. I mean, that level of care it's a marked change from the previous approach. There's nevertheless still an enforcement process, but I think with the shift from the Trump to the Biden administration, there's been an effort to move away from that level of enforcement and deterrence to, okay, how can we help? You're stepping into the asylum process. How can we make this process a humane experience and an experience that restores dignity? And so we've seen that even the language and the rhetoric of the administration is a significant change. Questions around dignity, questions around welcome, questions around ensuring that folks make it through a process and are cared for along the way. That's been refreshing. So you can imagine the confusion then when the Remain in Mexico policy is suddenly once again within this new administration a part of what folks are having to deal with, to work through. So there are parts of this which are very confusing. Shelter residents have heard a more humane approach is at play. Some of the lawyers from Arizona Justice for Our Neighbors that provide legal aid workshops at our shelter 3-4 months ago were walking folks to the border, making sure they got on transportation to the shelters in Tucson to take the next step in their asylum process. Right now, it's a standstill. So there's a distinction between both administrations, but there is also a lot of confusion as to, okay, so what is taking place? So yeah, it's a mix. Yeah, our partners are trying to work within this fluid, confusing sort of mix of policy that draws from two administrations. And so again, it's been confusing. And I think folks continue to come to the border hopeful, but then are met with these policies that continue to echo the previous administration. So, pastoral care in the middle of that confusion is hard work. To be non-anxious in the middle of that, but also to continue to provide clear communication is key for us, key for our lawyers, key for our shelter director, key for all of us, so that we can keep a sense of clear communication and of what is trending, what's on the way, and what is the status quo.
Yeah, I know that we're just because of gridlock in the U.S. Congress, that like a comprehensive immigration reform is not like on the close horizon. But I wonder what advice you have for legislators who still hold a hope for that, for an immigration reform that it leads us to a more humane place.
I think it's listen to the stories. I think that there is a change in the approach on our end and in activists who are active around migrant justice. And that is to make sure the stories are heard. Handing over the mic is key to our moment. and for legislators to hear from folks who have stepped into the asylum process and the necessity for a humane approach to immigration policies. I think hearing stories of not only folks who have made it through or are in the midst of the asylum process, I think that's key. I think the other piece is, to harken back to our narrative as a nation, to continue to insist that a faithful welcome is congruent with our identity, even though that identity has a particular, aspects of its narrative that need to be critiqued and interrogated. I think that sense of providing faithful welcome, a welcome that restores dignity, a welcome that views the individual not just simply as a social or political category, but as a human who is coming in search of life, in search of a future. I think that's key, and I think that realizing that and encouraging legislators to, if I could host legislators to our border pilgrimage, man, I would do it. Because there's nothing like seeing the on the ground realities, the terrain, the sensibilities and the sense of what life in these not only shelters but along the border. I think that sort of immersive experience, I think, can move hearts. I don't know that it'll change it, but I think it can move hearts. And so for us, it's handing over the mic, listen to the stories, get a sense of the space, and also recognize that providing faithful welcome is who we are.
Yeah.
At least I believe that that's who we are.
Yeah, I love that. Faithful welcome. It's so important. COVID has just had such massive effects on everything around us. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about both the effect that COVID had on the border and then just what your ministry's been like over these last 2 years. I mean, we've been through so many changes, and I wonder if you can just reflect a little bit about what they mean to you.
Sure. Well, at the border, COVID shut everything down. And in many ways, it was, a sense of lockdown took place. And part of my ministry in the midst of COVID is connected to this lockdown. While that lockdown took place, we stepped up our presence with our partners at La Casa de Misericordia. And so a lot of the work that we did as the steering committee for Cruzando Fronteras was to really take the time to assess what it means to do this kind of mission. And so we took the time to really grapple with, in the midst of the pandemic, and also in the midst of the sort of racial reckoning that was taking place, to really begin to think about the way that we, as the Diocese of Arizona, with our partners, the Lutheran, the ELCA, and the UCC, of what border ministry looks like, and what it would. And so we began to interrogate, are we living out of a paternalistic colonialist perspective on the border and on migrants? So we did the hard work of looking and trying to do that, what some call adaptive work around our values. And what came out of it was a binational steering committee made up of our partners and us, in conversation not only around mission, but also budget, conversation around what it means to care for and be with and accompany migrants in transition. And so we decided that this was a great time to learn and unlearn some of the impulses that are part of the settler narrative here in the Southwest. And so part of the work that we did through the Cruzando Frontera Steering Committee, and I sit on that committee as Bishop Redall's representative, was to really begin to think through the conceptual, the practices, and our presence with our partners at La Casa Misericordia. And out of that came a steering committee that's made up of not only our partners with the Diocese of Western Mexico, but also our partners at the shelter and a diverse group of Lutherans, Episcopalians, and members of the UCC to do mission, I think, and to provide that faithful welcome. Part of my work along that line as well during the pandemic was really to have conversations like the one we're having this evening with anyone who wanted to step into the space and begin to critically think about the border issues and concerns. So I launched Sin Fronteras, Reading Communities, and I led 6 reading communities of anywhere between 6 and 8 weeks. Folks from Boston, from Chicago, folks from Texas, from Arizona, California, Washington State, Washington, D.C. We were part of this broader conversation interrogating our understanding of the border. And we used a wonderful book written by Miguel de la Torre entitled The U.S. Immigration Crisis Toward an Ethics of Place as the foundational text to kick off our conversation. And it was one of those moments where you think, okay, so we're in the midst of a pandemic, and we have this space through this medium, this virtual meeting, to do the hard work of critiquing our own sense of how we view the border, how we understand what's taking place globally as far as the mobility of individuals, communities, looking at, I think it was interesting, I think the most quoted author during this entire season was Michel Foucault, the French philosopher.
Yeah, right. Funny.
Because we looked at surveillance, we looked at the pastoral role of the state, and how many migrants are expected to provide something along the lines of a religious confession when they arrive at the border. Why are you here? Why do you need? And so we looked at all of those dimensions, from surveillance to the narrative, to this sort of the clear narrative around the border as a geographical location. And we landed there to begin to look at the border as a social location. What is it? We carry borders. What does it mean that we live in a world of borders? And so it was a great season of thinking through the fundamental concepts that shape the conversation around the border, both philosophically and from a practical level. And so that's what I did during COVID. I spent my time diving into books, preparing conversations, questions, and Sin Fronteras really stepped into that space. And I think in many ways, we walked away with a bit of personal transformation and congregational transformation. So because folks are going back to their congregations saying, this is a conversation we need to have, even though we find ourselves way out here in this part of the country. And so that was, I have to admit, it was fun.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's a learning experience to hear from folks in Michigan who are working with the northern border and the dynamics at play there, and just a community of conversation, growing, learning, and praying together.
Do you have any particular moments that stood out for you? I wonder what someone, say from Boston, a moment where you made a real breakthrough in helping them to understand, what's at stake. Because I totally get what you mean about borders as being a cultural context for us, the construct that borders they're not. There's no such thing as a natural border. We're the ones who make them, and they have a history. But I wonder if you can talk about just like those moments of insight and learning that you may have witnessed in those groups.
Yeah. We started with the sessions with Miguel de la Torre's U.S. Immigration Crisis, then moved on to a book by Cristina Beltran entitled Cruelty as Citizenship. And it's a deep dive into settler colonialism. It's a deep dive into really the concepts that shape a particular joy among certain people to practice cruelty towards the other.
Yeah.
And so I remember it was someone from Washington State who began to really reflect on Beltran's language and the sense of having to go back and reassess the concepts and language that you've used to describe a certain phenomenon or a certain reality, and to go back and to think, okay, wait a minute. I think it was Audre Lorde who said, you can't undo the master's house with the master's tool. we've been using the master's tools, concepts, and ideas to try to deconstruct, and to have those moments when there's this sense of, but wait a minute, there's this language that's coming, and the language that is surging from this context to help us look at our commitments, to look at where we are actually committed to a particular vision and version of the border. That is the master narrative. And so those moments when folks sort of wake up and say, oh, I'm living in the meta-narrative, and even my resistance is part of the meta-narrative. Right. How can I step away from that and begin to think about, for example, what Gloria Aldanzua talks about, the border as en herida abierta, a wound that is open, where these two worlds grate against each other. And what results of that is a border culture, one that is rooted in the dichotomy or the binary of us and them, of safety and danger. And to begin to think about the border in light of that, or the school board meeting, when someone says we need to do away with this program, and then to see the border dynamics and reality take place right there in that instance, and to give and to be able to step into that space and say, okay, I know so this is what's going on here. To interpret, to exegete the moment in a way that moves you into action or activates your sense of border consciousness with and for the other. That was key. And I saw that in a variety, in Michigan, at Washington State, a variety, even some of our folks here in Arizona, waking up to a particular way of viewing the border, not simply as a line in the sand, but a site of contestation, but also an epistemic site where, things, the nature of reality, the nature of truth, our own sense of self is connected to our vision and version of the border. And so to have individuals sort of wake up to that moment and to find ways to fuel activism from that sense of sort of opening our hearts and eyes, that was key. It was key. And a lot of that, I think, had to do with the way that Beltran moves her argument forward. And so, yeah, those are moments. I call them going from incarnational perspectives on the border to an incarnational perspective. And not trying to be cute with language, but there is the sense in which there's a sort of religious praxis rooted in the narrative of domination, rooted in narratives around, settler colonialism, rooted in narratives about us and them in binaries that is very incarnational. And so to talk about the incarnational is to step into a space that is provisional, where we don't control, but we're invited in to see the other and to discover not only the other, but what it means to grow in the presence of the other. And so those were the moments, I think, where we sort of just stopped talking and said, okay, why don't we pray? Let's pray. and let's find a way to be active. Let's find a way to step into the space in a concrete way. And so I tend to go abstract, but luckily I had lots of folks around me who said, okay, we need to think in the concrete. Let's go to
David, you have such you have the heart of a teacher, like to quote the Bible. That's so deeply who you are. And I as soon as you started talking about this, you're right. I mean, COVID was a chance for us to alter our identity, to become more humane, to be more children of God, and to be more thoughtful and more careful and less likely to dismiss other people. In the introduction, I mentioned Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. She wrote this book called Not a Nation of Immigrants, and she was our guest like 3 weeks ago. But I mean, she totally opened my eyes to seeing, settler colonialism and the experience of Native Americans in particular, not as kind of epiphenomenal, not kind of like a sideshow that was something kind of happening on the periphery of the American project, but is at the very heart of what Americans were doing in affecting everything, like how we interacted with other countries overseas, and what our military commitments looked like. And it definitely was eye-opening for me, in just the same kind of way that you described, what your groups were experiencing as they talked about these really, really central issues. It's because this is about our identity. It's like who we are and how we regard the people who are around us, and what impact that has on our own sense of worth and understanding of ourselves. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like kind of what your childhood was like kind of, what was the path that you were on as a child that brought you to this point where we're talking on a rainy night on the internet.
I'll start with my mom and dad. My mom is Hondureña. She's from Honduras. She came to the States. She was an orphan and was raised in a convent in Tegucigalpa, and came to the States. Lived in Boston, Massachusetts, or actually in Cambridge. And her story, I remember just hearing her tell us her story of what it meant to her to come to the States, to learn English from records, to spend time immersing herself in a new country, and to, long for the family that she lost. When my mom's parents died, the 7 siblings were sent off to different members of the family. And so there was this, loss, but also the sense of care because the church took care of her. And so those stories were part of my everyday reality, from helping her understand English, reading books or reading forms for school registration, or for the Scholastic, when Scholastic sent those book forms that you could order books. So, that was part of my father is from Chihuahua, Mexico, and his father came to the States specifically to work in the copper mining industry here in Arizona with the Phelps Dodge Corporation. And so I knew my grandparents were from Chihuahua, and I knew that they'd made a long journey, and they came specifically to work for Phelps Dodge. They lived there in what is called Purtleville, Arizona, which is next to Douglas, which is like 5 minutes away from the Agua Prieta Douglas border. And as a child, I remember going to Agua Prieta for everything, from detergent soap to you name it,
candy and
maize for candy, you name it. I would spend half my day in Agua Prieta with my grandmother, along with my brothers and sisters, helping pick this out, pick that out, dinner, just shopping. And so that reality, that part of my imaginary is still vivid whenever I go visit our parish that is there in the Douglas, Agua Prieta area. And then, of course, growing up in San Diego, I grew up in National City, which is a suburb of San Diego, which is 6 or 7 miles from the border, and going to a middle school, elementary school with folks who came over from Tijuana.
Yeah.
Many students came from Tijuana to study in San Diego at a variety of the different school districts, the Chula Vista School District, and of course the National City School District. And so many of my friends were from Tijuana. And so as we grew up together, we learned together, we played together, I would go visit together. I would go visit in Tijuana. And of course, not when I was young, but as I, went into high school, you can go hang out in Tijuana.
Right.
Just have fun.
Yeah, exactly.
Go to the taquerias, go just enjoy the environment, enjoy my friends. And that's where I think my eyes opened up to some of the realities that my friends lived in. I went to some of the poorest colonias in Tijuana, Colonia Cacho, Colonia Mexico, where my friends lived. And there was a sense of conviviality, but there was also an awareness in my heart that my life was different. And that's also where I discovered that being mitad, or what they call mezcla, or a mix of Honduran Mexican, was an interesting tension because my friends let me know, oh, you're not Mexican. You're born in the States and your mom is from Honduras. So it was an experience of my own identity sort of coming together, coming apart, in the context of friendship, in the context of not only visiting the border, but the increasing development of the militarization of the border. I can recall when it became a task. It was, in Spanish, it's called una tarea, ir a la frontera. It was a task to get there and to begin to see the militarization of the border, and then to begin to hear the stories. I mean, I remember as a young boy in National City when the Border Patrol would make the rounds in our neighborhood. And I was always afraid because I knew that my mom, just from one experience we had where her passport, her green card was not accepted at the border, I was always afraid that they were coming for my mom. And so that border sort of consciousness, that experience, I think in many ways shaped and continues to shape the ministry that I'm doing. I tell friends, and when I go visit a church to preach and teach, that the border is not a physical location for me. It's my reality.
Yeah.
It's what I embody and have embodied. And so there's a sense in which, for me, the border is this very personal space because I inhabit that space, and it's been so as long as I can remember. And even now, I will go visit, whether it's Naco or Nogales, and I hold my breath when I make it to the station and hand over my passport.
Yeah.
I just don't know. And I think it's part of the experience of being a Latinx in America.
Yeah.
The border is not simply a site we go visit and transact with. It's a reality we embody.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important for folks to know that. And I know part of our reading group, that was one of those eye-opening moments for a lot of individuals, was that for the Latinx community, the border is a space that's embodied and also a space that we're consistently negotiating. It is a space that's liminal in many ways, but at the same time, it's very, very clear. And when your space is shaped by policy, and policy informs not only the way that you experience life, the limits, the possibilities, it can be a disconcerting experience if you're not grounded in community, and if your identity in Christ is, your identity in Christ. For me, it's my identity in Christ is that sense of grounding in love, that grounding in community, that allows me to exist as a disciple that reflects the border.
Yeah.
I'm
so glad you mentioned that about just how much the border is changing, because I just remember, you're exactly right. I mean, the militarization of the border. I remember when my brother-in-law and my wife started having a hard time going across the border. Like it started not being just a simple thing. And I remember what it was like, just being able to live in Southern California and just go across to Tijuana and see friends. And you're right. I think it's important for us to talk to our children about that, because I think they may feel kind of an inevitability about this fully militarized border, which it's not the way that things have always been. It's hard not to see that there's something beyond this, that we had a really live experience of, and things can change back to being a more humane experience. I wonder if you can talk a little bit just about like books and movies and things like that shaped your childhood, and what you learned about from things that you loved and you were interested in as a kid.
I think it's like a really good question. I think that there were moments where I was a dreary type of personality. I love Dostoyevsky.
Oh yeah, so, right. My son does too.
Right. And so early on, I was reading Dostoyevsky. There's one story, Netochka Nezvanovna. It did really, if I remember the story correctly, it is about a young woman in the question of belonging and being in a society of rejection. And so I remember identifying with that narrative. And I don't know, I think there was something like, my mom tells me I've always had this sort of philosophical sort of bent. And so I remember thinking about that, and also thinking about my friend John Archenbaum, who lived next to us and attended the Hebrew school right next to my elementary school. And it shaped the way that we understood our own space and our friendship, and what it meant to be, to confront what Emmanuel Levinas calls the allergic reaction to otherness.
Yeah.
And I saw that in Dostoyevsky. And not, I wasn't reading Levinas back then, but I knew there was this sense in which there was a rejection of John and a rejection of me, and we came together. And so books like that, I love books about space. And so there was always this sort of part of me that's connected to that which was beyond. To almost like a superabundance, to think about space, to think about the planet, to think about just that there's this infinite space out there, and those rare moments in city life where you can actually look out and see for just an instance, the starry sky before all the light pollution overruns the beauty of the sky, and then of course visiting my grandmother in Arizona, actually seeing sort of the starry skies. I remember space was a big, part of my, the world that I was living in. And I think it always provided me a sense of a place to step out in the midst of all of our constellation of issues in my barrio of National City. So yeah, and I'm fascinated by space, and I still continue to read Dostoyevsky and Stendhal, The Red and the Black.
Oh yeah, right.
Pieces that deal with the sense of identity, but also what it means to make your way in life. Those were some of the pieces that informed my thinking.
I loved space when I was a young person, and still do, like you say. And I think part of it is just we're learning so much just about like where we as human beings are in the world, and I love to understand that too. I mean, there's something about just science that I just think is so wonderful. I mean, learning more about the human story from a biological, a chemical, an astronomical point of view. Like I want to know kind of where we fit within the whole greater, larger picture, I love that about Emmanuel Levinas, to build your whole philosophy on the demand that another person's face makes on us just by their existence. I think he was one of the most important 20th century thinkers, and I think we're going to even discover even more how important he is in the future. I think Emmanuel Levinas, yeah.
I'm hoping that and that's the conversation that I'm having from that sort of Levinasian perspective on the border and the othering that takes place when a border is largely viewed through an instrumental lens and understood through a narrative that details everything in very clear, concise ways. I keep thinking there is a superabundance. That quote, "La tierra nos une, pero la frontera nos divide." The ground is the superabundance that is there, always already there, and invites us to step into. Whereas borders, to me, divide us, and whether they're conceptual borders, even religious, theological borders. The ground, la tierra, is that superabundant space that's always arriving, but inexhaustible. And so I bring that particular piece to the conversation around border issues and concerns, migration, the migrating neighbor, the stranger, and the necessity to move away from the sort of incarnational perspectives on what's taking place to a sort of an incarnational perspective that really puts us in a space of vulnerability. I mean, when we think about the pandemic, the shared vulnerability that we have with the entire globe, this is a space that opens up for, I think, the sense of not only radical transformation, but also the sense of a deconstructing of what we depend on in order to make sense of life.
Yeah.
You know, when I talk about the other as providing an experience that is provisional, I think that you know, when I think about theology, I think it was either Luther or Calvin's idea that all theology is provisional understanding.
Right. It's always reforming.
Right. The other, I think, presents that to us here in the border as an opportunity.
Yeah, and that other person's face is both revealing something and something's hidden in it. So you can't master that. You can't say, I know everything of David. You know, I mean, but at the same time, we can see pain on each other's faces. We can see suffering. We can see joy, and it's very, very powerful, I think, way of looking at the world, to think that if you really want to see God, like in a person's face, that's the place to start.
Agreed. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just how you decided to get ordained and to embark on this extraordinary adventure that we're just getting such a wonderful glimpse of tonight.
Well, I started out with the PCUSA. I went to Princeton Seminary and I did an MDiv and considered doing a PhD, and then decided to do a THN to see if this was the path. And in the process, realized that I missed community. I missed being in the midst of the church. And so it started just within the PCUSA. Was under their care process for the ordination, their ordination process. Along the way, like anything you do as a Latinx, you discover where the systems are, and you discover how the system responds. And so I remember having to work through that particular piece. And luckily I had wonderful mentors and pastors within the Presbyterian Church to help me guide me through many of the alienations and many of the challenges that I faced as a person pursuing ordination. And so after seminary, I served in the PCUSA for 12 years, Columbus, Ohio, and then San Clemente, California. And while in seminary, Tom Breitenthal, who was the Dean of Religious Life at Princeton University, I was a seminarian at the seminarian doing my internship at the university. He sat down with me and said, let's talk about your vocational path. Have you ever considered the Episcopal Church? And so that was the first conversation. I think it was an important conversation around this question of the priesthood within the Episcopal Church. And then, of course, in San Clemente, Diane Jardine Bruce was the rector at St. Clement's before she became the bishop in LA. And just a community of conversation, so that when I landed here in Phoenix and attended Trinity Cathedral, and Dean Troy Mendez, after stepping away from the PCUSA, just invited me into another conversation that says, hey, this is a space where, if you want to have a conversation about, well, what's next for your life, let's do that. And so we started having conversations. There was a Latino ministry at the cathedral at Trinity in Phoenix. And I told Troy, hey, I'm more than happy to hand out bulletins to clean up after. And he says, sure, you can do that, but would you like to preach? I said, sure. And began to preach as a layperson within the Episcopal Church. And then Bishop Kirk at that time said, what are you thinking about doing for the next couple of years? Would you consider the formation process for the Episcopal Church? And while you're doing that, I have these two congregations. There's a Iglesia Santa Maria, a mission, and the Cathedral Congregation the Latino congregation of the cathedral. While you do your process, how would you like to serve these communities? So it was a wonderful opportunity. I stepped into that door, and moved as ordained as a transitional deacon on December of 2018. Was ordained to the priesthood on the first Friday of the Posadas, and so we had the Posada processional throughout downtown Phoenix, and then came back to the cathedral doors to start the service of ordination. It was just a beautiful, beautiful experience.
Sounds like an amazing day. I wish I could have been there. You're like the most perfect Episcopal priest, by the way. I would definitely, if I moved to Phoenix, I'd want to be in your congregation for sure.
Very kind of you.
You can reflect a little bit about, these new technologies that you described. That you're right. All of a sudden, you were able to have a church that was on the internet, and people in Boston and in Arizona and in Minnesota and in Washington were all able to participate. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about just like the new technologies and how they influence what's possible in terms of ministry.
Sure. I think it's been, when new technologies enable community, I think that's key. And I think that's been my experience with the technologies at play to gather folks. And so that's key. I think so long as technology does not become instrumental, I think it can foster community conversation. It can help foster rich conversation, because it's one thing it's amazing to hear someone from Chicago reflect on the border with someone in Arizona. Yeah. And so again, it draws, these experiences, these notions of self and space, where folks get together and begin to have a conversation. So when technology, if it simply exists as instrumental, I think that's where it loses its potentiality to be a space or a space creator for conversations, for conviviality, for learning, for care, for being present with one another. It certainly calls into question so many of the foundational categories around what it means to be. But I don't sit around thinking about that. I'm enjoying the conversation with somebody. In the back of the mind, I'm thinking, okay, so what would Heidegger say about this? Right. But for the most part, I think the sense that it promotes and fosters conviviality, I think, is key. And then to connect with folks in Brazil, in different parts of Latin America, in Europe. It's just been astounding to hear the richness in the contributions of the global community around, for example, a conversation I was a part of over the summer on liturgy and enculturation, led by voices from the sort of Southern Hemisphere, so that these epistemologies of the South begin to inform and call into question the way that we understand things. And so there is this generative aspect to the technology at play that I hope doesn't, never goes away. I think at one point we can continue to improve on it. I'm really interested to find out what neuroscientists have to say about what this means, because I think that'll be key for us on how to use these tools more effectively. So yeah, I'm thankful for the toolbox we have, but there is also that side of me that says, but let's keep our eye. Let's have a sort of, let's not forget to have critical moments around the tools that
pay attention to these and what other effects they're having. But you're so right. That we can be part of a global community of theologians and philosophers that we would never have access to people like that if it weren't for this incredible device. I'm glad you reminded me of that, because when someone says technology, it's so easy for me to think of manipulating elections and Facebook and young girls' sense of self-esteem and self-worth, and it's good to be reminded of just the higher callings. The other part of it that I love is just we have morning prayer online now, and there's no reason not to be part of it now. You know what I mean? So people are not alone in the way that they needed to be. If you were at a remote nursing home in Northern California and there wasn't a way to participate in daily morning prayer, and now you can dial into Grace Cathedral and be part of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's our shelter residents, because of the technology at work and play right now, to receive legal aid and assistance, to have that as a platform to tell their stories. I mean, it's even on the front of border issues and concerns and migration, technology is as the way that some of our partners are using it as in a very, you could say, a redemptive, transformative way of drawing connection for the sake of migrant justice has been very important. And I'm thankful for what's taking place through the mediums we presently have.
Yeah, and I'm understanding better what's happening at the border, migrant justice. Like, I have a better picture of it as a result of these technologies. If I was just watching the same 3 television stations or reading the same 3 national newspapers, I wouldn't have as nuanced a picture of what's happening in that part of the world. I'm wondering, I just can't believe we have 3 minutes left. I feel like we just started like a minute ago. I have so many more questions for you. But to wrap things up, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just, what you've learned from the churches that you've worked with at the border, and just if any suggestions that you have for what ordinary people might do to be able to help.
Sure. St. Stephen's, Douglas. I think let me back up. Leadership is so key, and to have a bishop like Bishop Redall to provide a context of leadership that is open to creativity and to finding different ways of responding to the moment, I think is key. And so, for example, St. Stephen's in Douglas, Father John Caleb. Just a sense of the entrepreneurial spirit to say, this is what's taking place in the border. How can we be involved in this? And to transform the fellowship hall into a waiting station for migrants who are taking the next step in their asylum process to receive the care and love and faithful welcome of St. Stephen's and the Diocese of Arizona. That's key, is to step into that space and say, how can we provide faithful welcome? Yeah. And I think that's the question that can help other communities. What does faithful welcome look like for us? It might not look like for us to go to the border, but what does it look like to explore the borders in our own lives, around us?
Yes.
To call into question the sort of incarnational approaches to Christianity and insist on the incarnational accompaniment of the migrating neighbor for the sake of the gospel, for the glory of God, for the sake of the neighbor. And so I think that's important, to sit down and think through space, think through opportunities, and also think about how that may actually transform the way you do life, liturgy, and budget.
Right.
to be very practical about it. So, yeah, that's one particular congregation, our congregation in Douglas, Agua Prieta, doing amazing work and fostering partnerships for the sake of serving the migrating neighbor.
Yeah, that's great. We've had a lot of questions. People have been asking us about just different books that we've referred to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you just to email me the reading list for your book groups. And then, we'll put in Stendhal's The Red and the Black and the U.S. immigration crisis and cruelty and citizenship. So we'll put all of those in the description on the YouTube video for this. So in a couple of days, look in the YouTube description. We'll have the books that David mentioned. Like I said, I can't believe that our time is up, but it's been such a blessing having you, David. And I can't wait I know that our paths are going to cross someday. I look forward to that very much. For all of you who are watching, please join me next week when my guest will be Dr. Harry Edwards, sociologist, civil rights activist, and the leading authority on developments in the interaction of race, sports, and society. We'll be talking about sports, athletes, and how they play a role in healing racial injustice and inequity. So David, this is my old professor who was very involved in the 1968 Olympic boycott movement.
Nice.
An extraordinary person. So I'm looking forward to it very much. And for everybody else, we rely on your gift for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give it on gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK, T-H-I-N-K, to 76278. That's 76278. And thanks again to David Chavez for joining us tonight. Good night and stay well, everybody.
Good night.